Now today's passage is chapter 9, verse 18. Once when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God." Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone. And he said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life." Then he said to them all, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will save it. What good is it if a man gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit his very self? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God." About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, became as bright, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. And as the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. And while he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them. And they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud, "This is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen. The next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions, so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." "O unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." And even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the evil spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. While everyone was marveling at all that Jesus did, he said to his disciples, "Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men." But they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them, so that they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. We've reached a very significant passage. I've called it the turning point, because from now on the whole story changes. Up to now he's been preaching, healing, casting out demons, but all up in the north, in Galilee. But from now on, he will set his face to go south to Jerusalem and to his death. So that this marks this great turning point, and it all happens in one spot. One of the great advantages of going to Israel is that you realize how connected everything in the Bible is with where it happened. There's a geographical dimension to Jesus' ministry which you don't really fully realize until you're actually there and see the place. And you think, so that's why that happened here. And the background to the whole reading I've given you is that in the north of Israel there's a snow-capped mountain, the tallest mountain in Israel, and it's always covered with snow. The Israelis have put a ski lift on it, and they now ski down it. But of course in Jesus' day it was virtually inaccessible. And wherever you are in Galilee, you can look up to the north and you see the snow-capped mountain. It's so striking. I wonder if I can show it to you. This is a book of photographs of the Holy Land taken from outer space. And I don't know if you can see that. It looks like the map of the Middle East. In the bottom is just a glimpse of the Dead Sea, and then the Jordan Valley goes straight up to the top, because the Jordan River begins at Mount Hermon in the north. And you can see the snow-capped mountain up there. The Sea of Galilee is in the middle there, already below sea level. And then just though you can see palm trees at Galilee, you can look up and see snow-capped mountain. It's just amazing. Now, up till this point, Jesus has not been near that mountain. But everything I read to you took place up there at the snow-capped mountain. And that was quite deliberate. What he wanted to say to them had to be said up there. And the first scene we're looking at is at the foot of Mount Hermon, at the bottom of it, at a very unusual spot, because at the bottom of Mount Hermon is the most extraordinary sight. There's a red sandstone cliff, vertically right at the foot, as if somebody's chopped it off. And from the foot of that cliff, there comes a river 20 or 30 feet wide, straight out of the rock. And that's the beginning of the River Jordan. And it's because the snow on Mount Hermon melts and goes down a big crack inside the mountain and comes out at the foot of the mountain. Below the opening of the crack is below the water. So it looks as if a whole river starts from nothing and just comes straight out of the cliff. And it goes all the way down to the Dead Sea. You can imagine that that would be a very religious place because of its unusual site, and it is the most exciting part of any trip I've taken people out to see. Because carved in the cliff face are alcoves shaped like an archway, like that, and they're carved out of the cliff. And in those alcoves there were little statues. People worshipped there. In one of those little alcoves was the god Pan. I'm sure you've heard of the god Pan and his panpipes. He was a Greek god who was supposed to appear as a man on earth. And so they worshipped the god Pan at that very spot. And even today, the village nearby is called Panias, after the god Pan. And in another of the alcoves was a statue of Caesar, the Roman Caesar, who was a man whom people thought was a god. And the village nearby that is now called Panias was called in Jesus' day Caesarea Philippi, after both the Roman Caesar and Philip, one of the 4 relatives of Herod who governed that part of the Holy Land. And Jesus took the 12 disciples to that very spot where there were gods who appeared as a man and men who thought they were gods. And you can understand now why he took them there and said, "Who do people think I am?" He was giving them clues by taking them to that very spot. I've got another book here, which is a group I took to the Holy Land, who all were helpers with me in distributing my teaching worldwide. And this is us at the foot of that cliff, at the foot of Mount Hermon. And it's an awesome place. I think you can see at least one of the alcoves behind my head. And that was the place where Jesus said, "Who do people think I am?" You can see behind me a God who became a man and a man who thought he was God. But who am I? That's the most important question anybody could ever ask. What you think of Jesus determines your whole life and has such a difference. On the other side of that page is a glimpse of the River Jordan at the foot of the cliff. And you can see how wide the water is there. And that's the place where this first thing happened, which we call the Great Confession. I took my daughter to that place once, and it was pouring with rain. And we were miserable because even the coach, the windows were covered with mud. But we got out of that place and we walked through the rain and in the mud to the foot of the cliff. And I read this bit of the Bible to them. And just as Peter said, "You are the Christ," and just as I read that, lightning struck a tree just by us with a great crash of thunder. And before we knew where we were all lying down in the mud, face down. It was such a shock that came that. But it's always been a special place. And everybody I've taken there has been profoundly moved. Well now, the first thing to say is that Jesus asked them first, "Who does everybody else think I am?" And the answer came in an unusual form. They are sure that you're a reincarnation. You're only in your early 30s and you're such a great person. You must have lived before. You couldn't have become such a great person in that short time unless you'd had a previous life. "Oh," said Jesus, "who do they think I was in my previous existence?" And they said, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist who's come back to life." Remember that Herod chopped John the Baptist's head off for the sake of a dancing girl. And they said, "It's John back to life." And the second person they said it might be was Elijah, come back to life, reincarnate. And then they said, "Well, most people are sure you've been one of the prophets before." "Right," said Jesus, "that's very interesting, but now I want to know, who do you think I am?" And that's the big question. He's waited 2.5 years to ask that question. He's taken them with him and preached the kingdom and healed the sick and delivered them from demons. He's done all that and given them clues. He's fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He's stilled the storm. He's given them clue after clue after clue. And he says, "What conclusion have you come to?" And Peter said, "You're the Christ of God." Now, he said more than that, and the other Gospels tell you what more he said. But what Peter was saying was, you have lived before, but not on earth. You've lived in heaven before. You're the Son of God, the Son of the living God. That's the only explanation of what you say and what you do. And we've watched you for 2.5 years, and we're convinced you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus was thrilled. He'd waited 2.5 years for someone to say that from the disciples. And he says, "You're absolutely right, but you mustn't tell anybody. It's a secret, and you mustn't share it." You've hit on the answer. And he said, "It's not just you who's come to that conclusion. My Father has been telling you all this time. And now you've realized the truth. Now I can go to Jerusalem. Now I can die." And he's only 33. He says, "Now I can die." It's amazing. And from that moment, he set his face to go south into his worst enemy's camp at Jerusalem. And they knew what would happen to him. And above all, he knew. He said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the scribes and be killed and be raised on the 3rd day." That's the first time he'd mentioned either his death or his resurrection. Wasn't the last time. He's going to tell them again and again, this is what's going to happen to me in Jerusalem. And they can't face it. Now, we don't know the sequel in this gospel. We know it in Mark. Peter wasn't having it. "Far be it from you, Lord, to die. You can't do that. I won't let you." And Jesus said, "Satan's put that into your mind. My Father put the truth into your mind. Now Satan's got hold of you. Get behind me, Satan. I've got to die, and I will be raised from the dead on the 3rd day." Now the next paragraph is a little difficult. It's obviously little sermonettes, little couplets of 2 statements, and each one of them would make a sermon, and I could take even one of them and spend the rest of today on that, but I'm not going to do that. All I can do is just say that as he walked with them wherever he was, He was teaching them, talking to them, telling them things they needed to know. And they remembered. And in verse 23 to the end of that paragraph, you've got at least 5 potted sermons. And each of them is important. He has told them what's going to happen to him. Now he's going to tell them what will happen to them. And the first thing he says is, if you're going to follow me, it means a cross. You'll need to take up your cross every day and deny yourself and live as if you're dead and follow me. In other words, it's tough to be a disciple. It's tough to be a Christian. It involves a daily crucifixion. I'll leave you to think about that. The next thing it says is this: if you want to keep your life, if you want to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose it, for my sake, you'll save it. And that's comforted many Christian martyrs over the centuries. If you want to hang on to life, you'll lose it. But if you don't want to and let it go, you'll save it. It doesn't sound anything other than a contradiction. But it's true. And Christians have found it to be true. And then he says, what good is it if a man gains the whole world and loses himself? Paul Getty lived just half a mile from us in a great big mansion. One of the richest men in the world. He even had a pay telephone in the guest bedroom to prevent guests bringing their relatives in Australia at his expense. Poor man. He fell in love with a girl, a young lady who was very attractive and very gifted and would have made him the perfect wife. And guess what? She was the daughter of a millionaire. And she couldn't get out of her brain the idea that he was marrying her for her money. And so she refused him. And he didn't marry. But that, to me, was a big tragedy because he only found out much too late, when she married someone else, that she was the daughter of a millionaire. And he thought she was marrying him for his money, and vice versa. It's one of those Greek tragedies that happen. But what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world? And he was then one of the richest, and he'd gained much of the world, and he was an unhappy man. And he was losing himself. I could spend a whole evening on that one. The next one, sermonette, Jesus told them, if anyone is embarrassed or ashamed of me and my words in this world, when I come back to this world, I'll be ashamed of him. There's a thought. Have you ever been embarrassed to admit you're a Christian, that you belong to Jesus, that he's alive today? Jesus said, you'll make me ashamed of you when I come back. And the last little sermonette, he says this, I tell you the truth. Favorite saying of Jesus, I'm telling you the truth. Some of you standing here will not die before you see the kingdom of God. And they were still alive in the days of the Acts when they saw the kingdom of God come with power. Well, those were just a few sermonettes on the way up the mountain. Because they were climbing Mount Hermon, they got above the snow and got to the top. Now that would be an exhausting climb, because Hermon is just short of 10,000 feet. And you don't climb 10,000 feet up a mountain without feeling tired. And when they got to the top, it says the disciples were sleepy. And I'm not surprised. They'd had that big climb. But the first thing they saw was what I've called a heavenly fluorescence. The most amazing sight was Jesus' face changed, his clothes changed, and as Peter told Mark later, his clothes were brighter than any soap on earth could get them. Any fuller on earth couldn't have made them brighter. And the secret was this: the light was shining inside his clothes, through them. In other words, Jesus himself became a blazing light. His face shone, his body shone through his clothes. And if you've ever shone a torch behind your shirt or blouse, you know what that would look like. Luke said his clothes looked as if there was a flash of lightning going through him. They were being given a glimpse of what Jesus had looked like in his previous life. They were seeing the glory of the Son of God as he used to look before he became a human being. I think that's so interesting that after they'd guessed who he was, Peter, James, and John were given a glimpse of his previous life in heaven. Later they would write down, "We beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten Son of God." Peter, in his epistle, talks about this, how they saw his glory with their own eyes. It must have been an unforgettable sight. And it's how Jesus will appear when we see him. It's no wonder that Paul was blinded by that. It was too bright for his eyes. But Peter, James, and John saw Jesus transfigured. They saw him in his heavenly glory, and his clothes became fluorescent. Now, I've got another picture to show you. It's a picture by Charles Butler, painted in the year 1916. And it's called The King of Kings. And it appeared in the Royal Academy in London. This is only a rather poor copy of it. But here's Jesus, King of Kings, and surrounding him are portraits of all the kings and rulers of the world, 160 of them. And each of them is painted in the attitude he had towards Jesus. And the interesting thing about the painting is that Charles Butler was able to make Jesus' clothes shine from the inside. No one has ever been able to repeat the luminescence of Jesus' robes in this picture. And Charles Butler never told anybody how he did it. But it was his great work. Here's Edward the Confessor offering his crown to Jesus. Here's Napoleon, aloof and looking at Jesus as if he has contempt for him. Behind Jesus, you can see the prince of this world, the devil, dark and forbidding, and he's shrinking back from Jesus. But look at the luminosity of those robes. They just, in the original oil painting, they just shone out as if a light was behind them. How Charles Butler managed to do that, I don't know. But that's how they saw Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. They were amazed what they saw. And to their astonishment, when they became fully awake, they saw 3 people covered in glory. Not 1, but 3. And with that instant recognition, which we shall all have in heaven, they recognized 2 people who'd been dead for centuries. And they recognized that's Moses and that's Elijah. And they too had glory shining through them. And it says that Jesus discussed with them, my Bible says, the departure that he was going to fulfill in Jerusalem. But in fact, the Greek says the Exodus. And Moses was saying to Jesus, now you're going to do an Exodus in Jerusalem. You're going to set a whole lot of people free by your death. And they discussed Moses and Elijah representing the law and the prophets, or the 2 great prophets of the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. They discussed with Jesus his exodus that he was going to make in Jerusalem. And then Peter put his foot in it. I have a lot of sympathy with Peter because I put my foot in my mouth frequently. And he was always saying the wrong thing. And he said, this is the most wonderful experience of my life. Let's put up 3 shrines. 3 shelters for the 3 of you. Let's capture this moment and keep it. That's what he was saying. And it says he didn't know what to say. Well, he sure didn't. Because immediately he said that, they were enveloped in a cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud. This is my son. Listen to him. And the cloud went away. And there was only Jesus left. The glory had gone. He was no longer shining. Just Jesus. And this voice was a rebuke to Peter. Listen to him. Stop talking. You're talking rubbish. You're making silly suggestions. You can't capture this moment and embody it in 3 shrines on the mountain. This is a passing moment. It's a glimpse into heaven. It's a glimpse into the life that Jesus had in heaven before. To put it quite simply, everybody else said Jesus was reincarnate. Reincarnation was a popular idea then. It still is. But Peter said, you're not reincarnate. You are incarnate. You have lived before, but in heaven. You're the Son of the living God. And that was right. So Peter, having said the right thing, always said the wrong thing a few minutes later. And here he was trying to enshrine the moment in 3 buildings. And when you go to Israel, one of the things that does put you off are the buildings that Christians have put up to enshrine big moments in the life of Jesus. And they've spoiled it. Because they can't pray without a church building around them. That's why so many of the gospel events are enshrined in a building. If you go to the place where the Sermon on the Mount was, there's a beautiful church called the Church of the Beatitudes, and it was built by Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, equivalent to Hitler. And he put that up so that Christians could pray where the Sermon on the Mount was preached. What a tragedy. But when the Christian pilgrims began to go to the Holy Land, they said, let's put up shrines wherever something happened. And they've covered the Holy Land with shrines, with churches. And the pilgrims used to go from church to pray. Now they didn't build one on top of Mount Hermon, thank God. And so they built a church for the Transfiguration on the top of a hill in the middle of the plain of Esdraelon, Mount Tabor, or Tabor. And that's where you'll find the Transfiguration celebrated and where you can pray. And that's 30 miles from where it happened. But if you care to climb the 10,000 feet and get above the snow line, you're at the right place. I haven't climbed up there. Haven't even taken the ski lift. You can do that now. And so there they were left speechless, and temporarily they didn't tell anybody what they'd seen. They couldn't. And so for our third event, we're back down at the bottom of Mount Hermon. So you see how this mountain played such a part. They confessed who Jesus was at the foot of it. He was transfigured on the top of it so that his clothes were whiter than the snow and brighter than the snow. And then they came down again with a bump. And I've labeled this third event treachery, because for the first time the disciples were going to let him down, and one of them was going to let him down badly. When they came down from the mountain, there was a huge crowd waiting, and there was a man in the crowd who called out, Jesus, please, can you do something for my only son? And he pleaded with Jesus. Look what's happening to my son. He's being destroyed by an unclean spirit. And this spirit causes him to foam at the mouth and have convulsions and throw him on the floor. And constantly doing this. And he's destroying my boy. Please do something about this. And then he added, I brought the boy to your disciples, and they couldn't help him. And Jesus had given the disciples authority and power and sent them out. They could have dealt with it, and they didn't. In another gospel, we're told why. And Jesus said, you can't do this casting out demons without prayer and fasting. Which is much as say, that's what you're missing. So don't try and do this in your own strength. You'll fail. And then Jesus demonstrated frustration. Jesus was very human, and he said, how much longer do I have to put up with you? This perverse and unbelieving generation. How long shall I stay with you and put up with you? A very human reaction. And Jesus was impatient with the disciples. They should have been able to deal with this, but they just hadn't. They just couldn't. How much longer do I have to put up with this? That's what Jesus is saying. He's really frustrated. And we must understand his humanity when he gets frustrated like this. Bring the boy to me, he says. And even as they brought the boy, he convulsed. And the evil spirit took hold of him and threw him on the ground, and he foamed at the mouth. And Jesus said, come out of him. And he came out. And he gave the boy healed, cured, back to his father. Lovely moment. And the crowd were amazed. They saw it happen. They saw the boy on the ground, flinging himself around. And they saw Jesus tell the demon, come out. And they saw him come out. And the boy was perfectly normal and given back to his dad. But the interesting thing is, they didn't say, isn't Jesus great? They said, isn't God great? Now that's very interesting. They realized that it was God in Jesus who was throwing out the evil spirit. Now we come to something very serious. They've come down from the mountain with the 3 disciples who went up it with Jesus, Peter, James, and John. They were special disciples and were given special experiences. And they came down to meet the 9 apostles who had failed to help this boy. And so already there was a failure among Jesus' 12 apostles. But worse was to come. And Jesus said, listen very carefully to what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to be betrayed. Now this is the first time he'd said this. Someone's going to betray me. And he's talking to the 9 apostles, among whom is Judas Iscariot. It's the first time Jesus had said this in the presence of the man who was going to do it. And you can imagine his shock, because he was already a bit too fond of money. He was the treasurer, and he kept the cash that they were given to pay for their food and so on. And he'd helped himself to that cash. And he was creaming off some for himself. And Jesus now says, I'm going to be betrayed. Now that means it's going to be someone close to me who will sell me to someone else. Now later, at the Last Supper, Jesus said the same thing. Only this time he said, one of you will betray me. And their reaction was to ask, Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I? They asked a question. But this time, being the first mention of betrayal, it says they didn't understand what he was saying. And they didn't dare to ask him anything about it. It's so true to life, all this, isn't it? You can imagine them so shocked that no one said anything. Later, it was almost as if they'd got used to the idea and said, Lord, is it I? But this time, they didn't grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. But nevertheless, he'd said it in the presence of the one who would betray him. And we shall pick that up later in the story. Well, that's taken you through the passage for today. And next we'll pick it up and take it on. But this is the turning point where the whole of Jesus' life changed, and where the disciples were given a glimpse of how he had lived before, not on earth as a prophet, but in heaven as the Son of God, and with the glory of the Son of God. What a glimpse that must have been. But it was only a glimpse. One day we shall all see Jesus in his glory. And like Moses and Elijah, we shall be glorified. That's the final stage in discipleship. We're justified, then sanctified, and then glorified. And we shall share his glory. And whether you can cope with this in your imagination or not, one day your clothes will shine like lightning inside them. For we shall share his glory and reflect his image.